Matt, just over here to my left, has got a broad experience working in insurance. He's worked in several countries in Europe and also in the USA, Japan and Australia. He's fully qualified in 2 countries and is an associate actuary in the USA and holds a PhD in mathematics as well. And he's also the former chief investment officer for an insurer and has a great deal of investment experience as well. And I think, Matt, you were going to kick us off tonight and take us into the talk. Please.
Thanks for that, Elliot. Am I on? Great. Good evening. Did everybody get the homework assignment? Maybe the memo didn't go out, so I did it for you. I brought a current topic. This was in the Financial Times today, 12:02 a.m. Andrew Bailey calls on MPs to probe UK's Solvency II insurance reforms. Hope you don't mind if I quote a little bit. Skipping through. In a letter to the head of the Treasury Select Committee, Andrew Bailey, chief executive of the Prudential Regulatory Authority, warned that efforts to finalize Solvency II had, quote, ground to a halt, unquote, in the face of conflicting national interests. It would be helpful, he continues, if Parliament could cast light on a process that has gone on for the best part of 10 years, he wrote to Andrew Tyre, who chairs the TSC. Regulators as well as insurers had spent large sums, quote, to prepare for something that carries no promise in terms of when or in what form it will be implemented, unquote, said Mr. Bailey. He goes on to complain about the £3 billion price tag for implementing Solvency II, which he had done earlier this year. I just quoted him again. It's kind of a critical beginning, but I like the end of the article, which sort of fits in with my talk. And the last bit, it says, in the face of the delays, UK regulators have moved to address concerns of companies that have already spent years preparing for the regime by allowing them to adopt elements of it in advance. This allows them to avoid having to comply with different sets of regulations at the same time. And this is, I think, the topic that I would like to talk about today. I don't know what's going to happen to Solvency II. I personally am trying to figure out if we live in a pre-Solvency II world or a post-Solvency II world. So are we just waiting for it to come? Has it been delayed, or has it actually been derailed? I think actually that speculation isn't quite productive. I think it's fun sometimes to whine about these things, especially when the recent refocus has been on the Pillar 2 aspects rather than Pillar 1. Pillar 1 I think of as getting the model right, and Pillar 2 is getting the model used by the firm. Actually, it's trying to get the risk governance in order. But shifting the focus from Pillar 1, actually making the model, after we put so much time into it and saying, well, the real point is Pillar 2, has a little bit of an aftertaste of sour grapes. But that's when you're saying it critically. Actually, a lot of things have come out of Solvency II, which I like. Solvency II, at the end of the day, has changed the world, or at least the insurance world, or at least the insurance world in Europe. Maybe you have to qualify that a little bit. But it has given us a way to talk about risk, and it has given us a unified model for capital. So nowadays, whenever we talk about these things, we can say, oh, what we do is, it's like the standard formula, except we use different correlations, or maybe we use a copula, or we rearrange the different cascades of matrices. Or it's like Monte Carlo, except. And even when you look at the standard formula and Monte Carlo, those things are just 2 different shadows cast by the same object, this idea of a 1 in 200 event. So I think that whether it's a legacy of Solvency II or whether it's the vision still to come of Solvency II, there is a unified way that we're talking about capital management, and it is all about risk. And I think that that's very positive. The fact now that maybe it's going to come in a different form doesn't change any of that. A lot of companies are adopting for their ICA the models that they've already created for Solvency II. Somehow, the vision that is Solvency II is here with us today. That's kind of where this conversation is going to go. I'm talking about, since we're moving on to Pillar 2 and we're actually going to be using these models, let's get on with doing that. So this is my effort to move from my Pillar 1 focused career to my Pillar 2 focused career. Right, so let's do it. This is me, blah, 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 blah. All right, What I'm going to talk about tonight is 4 general topics. Lean is not light. I'll go with that to the second. How to think about life insurance, 7 concepts concerning insurance capital, and the spiral of capital improvement, which is the visual takeaway for the evening, if you'd like. Lean is not light is a general thing that I have to say whenever I talk about reducing capital requirements. There is a little hangover from previous years that the feeling that you're trying to reduce capital requirements feels like cheating. And that's when there was this divorce between the capital requirements and the risk requirements. But nowadays they are in line. If you're trying to reduce capital requirements, you're doing it through the reduction of risk. It is not the case that reducing capital requirements these days is skimping on capital. Reducing capital requirements these days is actually what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be making a less risky organization. There is sometimes I get the comment that, oh, you're just trying to be capital light. And that's actually not true these days. It is a valid thing to do to try to reduce capital requirements. It's in everybody's interest. How do I think about life insurance? How do I do all the rest of this? Let's get on with the rest of it. I've been an actuary for a better part of, well, a few decades, actually. But I do remember where my career started, and it wasn't with my first exam. It was actually when I was 13 years old. I was visiting my uncle. It was after my 8th year of school, and he told me about real estate. And he said, Matt, if you want to invest 100 in real estate and you think it's going to make 10%, you think it's going to make 10, then you earn 10%. Okay, Uncle John, that's great. But he told me, but suppose you borrowed 90 and you put 10 of your own in, then when the real estate made 10%, you double your money. Now, for a 13-year-old kid, this was like news. Oh, wait a minute, instead of making 10%, I can like double my money? How often can I do that? He never really told me too much about real estate, but that got into me, and I think about insurance companies as a capital management problem, as a leveraged game. The way I think about insurance companies is that we borrow money through premiums and we repay through benefits. And we're trying to make a spread on all that. I don't know that everybody looks at it this way, and a few people have taken me out and said, hey, that's quite an unusual view of it. But people who came up in the financial product side often think of it this way. Typical example, if you have so many assets and you have so many policy liabilities, you can make a leverage ratio, but that's not the way actuaries think about that. The fact that I've included this in tonight's topic is because I do this presentation for banks too, when they say, how should we talk about insurers? And they always want to know, if you think it's leverage, what's the leverage ratio? But it does come back to the leverage ratio will help you know what your return on capital is going to be. The basic equation for tonight, it's supposed to be technical, right? If you're making 4% on whatever your assets are, and you're able to make 1% of what your liabilities, that's a margin in your liabilities, the return that you're going to make on your capital ends up being the base asset return plus that margin multiplied by the leverage factor. This is why we're insurance in my version of the world. If we wanted to make 4%, we could just go invest in governmental bonds. Kind of, sort of, maybe not any governmental bond these days, but if we were willing to make that kind of return we can get on assets, we would just go do it. The reason we're in insurance is because we want to make an exceptional return. Return on capital, I guess, needs to be higher. Oh, but I think I'm preaching to the choir. Oh, I get to say that joke finally. Maybe you don't see the view the way I do here, but all right. You're going to be a tough crowd when it comes to jokes tonight, I can see. So, right. All right, the typical capital requirements are the highest of some, oops, this is a sensitive thing, of either a regulatory requirement, which can be formula-driven. You can think in the UK of the Solvency 1, Pillar 1 being kind of formula-driven, or a risk-based assessment, which is Solvency 2, Pillar 2, or an ICA, as many people are doing it these days. But in addition to that, insurance companies are cognizant not just of the capital required for regulatory purposes. They usually want to have something over that because of rating agencies, or just internally they might be wanting to have more capital to make sure they don't bump any other buffers. Nonetheless, the industry is moving towards a risk-based capital assessment, so the biting out of all these, at least the base of it, tends to be the risk-based assessment. We'll see a couple of examples in a minute. So This presentation assumes we have a model in place. So you're either talking about the standard formula, or you have your own internal model, or you're using your ICA. So this presentation is not a discussion about actually how to do any of these things. The question is, once you have it, what do you do with it? I'm going to try to take this sample company and improve its capital position. This is the advantage of being in a Solvency II world. I can write this model up here and say, well, I have all these individual risk factors. It's not the entire standard formula, it's just representative. I can add all those up. I get an aggregation benefit, and this is the beauty of not having to say too much. The aggregation benefit might come from whatever your aggregation model is, but it reduces the total to give it the actual capital requirement. In this case, it's 206. I do give the leverage ratio. You can ignore it if you're not into that. And let's suppose that this particular insurer is making 13% return on capital. They would like to improve that. Now, the first thing, and maybe I should have made this into a separate point, is you have to ask the question, what does it mean to improve your capital position? It is not the case that this is a clear statement. You can try to reduce the amount of capital you have. You could try to increase the return on capital. You could try to do it in different senses. Are you trying to increase IFRS profits? Or are you trying to do the ICA, reduce that capital? These are different measures that we can place on it. They're conflicting, and you have to come up with some sort of balance between them all. And while we're talking about the level of them, you could go to get the base case return on capital as high as possible, or you could try to reduce the volatility on earnings. So there's a host of things that you need to do, even with a model in hand, before you can decide how to improve it. You have to have a soul searching, at least among management, but usually among everybody, to ask, what is it that we're trying to do? For purpose of this presentation, I'm going to say, well, we're going to try to increase the return on capital, just to pick one. One of the ways we're going to do that is by reducing capital requirements. So what do? Most of my examples are going to be kind of investment-based for a couple of reasons. I do a lot of investments, so it's natural for me to talk about it. Second, insurance companies can change their assets easier than they can their liabilities. Not in all cases, but mostly. And I had another reason, but I forgot it. All right. So how do you increase it? Usually your best bets are to go back to the individual risks and try to reduce those and see what the effect on total capital will be. A difficult place to actually reduce risks is to play with the aggregation result. I use the word play because if you're going to get your benefit from the aggregation, usually there's a question, are you gaming the system or not? Are you actually reducing the capital? I suppose there could be situations where the aggregation is something you can talk about. Maybe between lapses and actual return on assets, maybe there's some process that you can do, but I'm not doing that tonight. So here's our first stop. Well, we're an insurance company. We want to have a better return. Maybe we can play with actually the longevity risk. My sample company has a longevity risk of 100 in the base case. Let's do something to bring it down to 80. Maybe they do more reinsurance or some magic that way. In the example that I have here, the capital goes from 206 down to 192. They lower the individual risk by 20, but the actual risk only goes down by 14. It's usually not 1 for 1. But in this case, the return on capital goes from 13 down to 12. It was reduced, which leads us to the first point. Often, this is the liability treatment is already optimized. So when you look at a company as right now, we actuaries have put a lot of effort into understanding the liability. To start by changing the liabilities isn't always the first thing that you can do to add value. We will come back to this later. If we change other things, maybe we have to re-optimize the liability piece. While we're at it, I would like to make a clarification of how I think about things. We often talk about materiality, but I think that there's two different types of materiality. When you read the regulations, they talk about a material risk. I refer to that as a materially large risk. In the previous slide, longevity was the largest risk on the slide. That's a materially large risk. In this process, in this project management, we're going to try to manage capital. The question is, is it materially manageable? Longevity might be a large risk, but maybe we can't change it at all. Its manageability is zero. It's very little that we can do about it. Since we're actuaries, I can say it this way. The materially large is like asking what the function value is, and materially manageable is asking what the first derivative is with respect to management actions. Right, materially large insurers, life insurers that I deal with usually have credit risk, equity risk, and longevity risk. Perhaps surprisingly, they don't typically have interest rate risk. If they didn't do ALM well, they would have a large interest rate risk. Most of the insurers that I see are doing ALM well and get rid of a lot of insurance risk. So the situation they're in today is there's not too much interest rate risk left on their balance sheet. All right, let's try a different methodology. All right, playing with the longevity didn't work. Let's try doing something about that big corporate credit number. That's an 80 number. That's our second big risk. Let's try to attack that. One thing that we can do is simply have less credit bonds. Seems intuitive. So instead of having 80 worth of credit, however we're measuring this, let's have only 55. Maybe in this situation, they take less credit risk and maybe a little bit more interest rate risk. I'm doing this just to make a point. It's okay if you make one better and another individual risk worse, as long as the final result looks better. And in this particular situation, the capital has gone from 206 down to 193, and our return on capital has increased. Have a nice day. Why would that be? As it turns out, investing in corporate bonds, although it gives you more yield and it increases your entire profits of the company, it's not particularly capital efficient if you walk through some of the calculations. I don't know what your internal model is, so this is where I get to say I'm using the standard formula, so it's a common thing we can look at. But in the standard formula, if you, oops, you should separate these buttons a little more. AAA 10-year corporate bond has a 10% capital requirement next to it. If you add that all up and say, well, we're also going to have an addition to the 10% that we add, this is for the ratings or maybe the internal management wants to increase a little bit. For any nominal amount of corporate bonds we have, we might have to hold 17% of that as capital. That increases our capital by that much. Well, what does that mean? I did a little calculation here. You can read it. I won't walk you through the whole thing. But that means since you're putting extra capital on, the capital is going to have a profit requirement because you're investing in capital. The first 204 basis points in my calculations just pays for the capital's return. So in other words, the bond is not adding anything unless it's making more than 204 plus a default charge of 214 basis points. If your corporate bond, these are made-up numbers, right? Don't go to the trading desk and do anything with this. Huh? But if the bond in this example isn't making 214, it's actually reducing your amount of free capital. It's increasing your capital requirements. So, concept number 3, you should recast investment targets versus capital rather than assets. Now, maybe this sounds obvious, or maybe it doesn't, but when you talk to a lot of investors, they have, I'm one of them, right, so I can do a little critical discussion here. They have a lot of investment targets versus the S&P, or they have versus this bond index. One of the articles that I did when I was a professor of actuarial science, which I haven't gotten around to publishing it, quite honestly, says that if you look at the capital asset pricing model, you have an efficient frontier. The efficient frontier changes in the presence of a large liability, like insurance companies have. Things that were previously on the efficient frontier can come off. That means that the standard models that you use in an investment-only world simply give you the wrong answer in a liability world. All right, let's try another one. Well, corporate bonds was fun. We moved from corporate bonds just into governmental bonds, and that had a benefit. Let's try something different. Let's move out of corporate bonds and move into property. Again, I'm not going to try to disrespect property. Great asset class. Just in the example I've used here, this had very little effect. When we moved some of our corporate risk into property risk, it only reduced the capital by 1. It went from 206 down to 205, and had practically no effect on our return of capital. The reason is I was assuming the property is making the same amount as the corporate bond. I was just trying to get the aggregation effect in my model. But why would this possibly not give us a good aggregation effect? And the reason is, standard formula, there's a very large correlation between corporate risk and property risk. So even though intuitively there might be an effect that you can get on your aggregate capital there, it doesn't come out of the model. Concept 4, not all diversification works. Just an example, no disrespect to real estate investors in the room. Another example, well, the problem with my example of property was that the correlation was too high. Is there another asset that we can get that looks like a bond and smells like a bond and works like a bond, and more to the point, I can do asset liability management with it like a bond, but is uncorrelated with bonds? So if there were these magic assets, they would be really nice. Here I have a new line, other bond-like things, and I move some of the corporate credit into there, assuming no correlation. This would have an enormous effect on capital, taking it down by from 206 to 180. It would also have an increase in our final return. The increase in the final return is not because this new bond-like creature that I've invented has a higher yield as an asset. That's because we have a lower amount of capital and we're getting the same profits from the insurance off of it. So this is strictly, this increase in RO, return on capital, is an effect that's coming from the aggregation from the reduced capital. All right, nice idea. What could these assets be? Concept 5, new asset strategies can be valuable in correlation if the correlation is low to existing strategies. The relative value to a hedgeable market should be demonstrable. So you have to prove that you can hedge it to be able to do the ALM. All right. Issues in terms of doing it, whatever this thing is it has to go into the ALM program, whatever it is, has to be accepted by regulators and managers. If it's a new asset, it's got an uphill travel. And they have to be readily available. If we're going to make a strategy out of it, I don't want somebody to come and say, hey, I have this farmer who's really willing to do one thing for us, and we can invest $1 million at a time. All right, here's some examples. Energy production. Solar and anaerobic digestion produce energy. They are fairly reliable. This is 30-year-old technology. It is stable, giving you an annuity. Completely illiquid. If you buy it, you're sort of there. It's not going to be going anywhere soon. Food production, the same thing. New dimension of risk, not energy. It's into food. You can argue that energy and food are related, but you're already getting an aggregation benefit there. Infrastructure bonds make the news. A lot of people know that. Commodity financing is another one that comes in. This can be a fairly valuable one. It looks a lot like a credit, but it is an independent dimension from credit. To be a little bit more provocative for the talk tonight, can you go into things that are not at all bonds? Here's an idea. Let's buy stocks and short the entire market versus it. In other words, a stock investor thinks he can beat the market. Stock investors talk about alpha all the time. Well, let's prove it. I want you to just give me the overperformance from the S&P 100. I'm going to take your stocks and short a future of the S&P 100, or I'm in the wrong place, FTSE 100, I should say. And if they are able to consistently beat the index, that'll come out similar to the way a spread comes out on a bond. Once we have that base case, we can hedge it using interest rate swaps to do whatever we need to for the ALM side. The last one, without going to the second last one, there are royalties. Now, a few of you know me, so you know that I invest in movies. This is something I do with my own money for speculative purposes. I'm not proposing that you go into speculative investments, that kind of royalties. You don't invest in movies when they're at the stage. I'm not even talking about movie royalties here. Just if you know me, you might say royalties. Matt's talking about movies again. But royalties can be a lot of different things. For example, if you got the royalties for ibuprofen, that would seem like a fairly stable stream of returns that you could get. People get headaches all the time. Probably it's uncorrelated with spreads on corporate bonds. Matter of fact, maybe it's negatively correlated, right? I bet you a lot of people got headaches during the credit crisis, especially if your royalties were selling to bankers. So, right. What else could we do? Let's go into the equity risk. One of our risks over here is this equity risk. This is 39. You'll see why it came out to be 39 in a second. But there is a way of doing out-of-the-money options that can reduce this risk as we do it in capital. The effect, before I tell you actually how to do it, is that it does reduce the equity exposure, that does reduce our overall capital requirement. It does bring our return on existing capital or remaining capital up from 13 up to 14%. Seems like a successful strategy. How does it actually go? In the equity realm, the average stress in the industry is about, the standard formula is 39%. The different range that was published recently by one of the consulting firms was somewhere between 39 and 50%. So if you're holding 100 worth of shares, your individual capital requirement would be 39% of that if you're using the standard formula, as I am here. That's how I got the 39 on the previous sheet. But if we did out-of-the-money options with a 20% out-of-the-money strike, the worst that net position could down is 20%, not 39. That's the advantage of it. Maybe that premium for that option, it's quite out of the money, is only 2% of notional. You can see that 2% of notional you can compare to the capital savings that you took of 19. That synthetic capital is 10.5%. Not a bad way of raising capital at 10.5%. There are issues in terms of doing that, but more interestingly, this is a case where two of the issues that you have, maybe I should go into that a little bit more. One of them is how do you roll these options over from year to year? And what's the availability of doing these? If you put those two together, you should say, let's not just hedge 1 year at a time, let's hedge several years at a time. Let's lock it up for 5 years or so. Actually, the pricing gets better if you buy longer dated options. If you did this strategy over 5 years, what you did over 1 year had a 10% cost, 10.5% cost of the synthetic capital of the savings you're getting. If you did it on a 5-year basis, it might go down to 6. Right. Not trying to go into this strategy too much, very technical, but there is scope there for saying, if we were able to lower this equity thing, it has a nice effect on aggregation. What's the technicals for doing that? We go get people who understand the technicals for doing that and see if it makes sense. This is actually a quick strategy. If you have this, out-of-the-money options are not liquid. You have to go negotiate them with investment banks, but they are out there. They're more than willing to sell them to you. You could do this kind of thing in a month or so. Some strategies might be quick to implement. The one I just did, very technical, but once you know how to do it, it can go quite quickly. All right. Maybe we can combine these. Everything I've been doing right now, all these strategies are one at a time. Let's do a bunch of them together. What's the effect of all that? This is one where I did everything but property. Property didn't seem to have that much of an effect, so let's just do everything but property. Here you can see all the effects that I've done throughout. In this case, it does have a desired return. The capital goes from 206 down to 147. Our return on capital goes from 13 up to a whopping 18, and you just think that it sounds pretty good. The trouble is, though, that implementing all of these takes a lot of effort, especially those magic bonds, remember? The ones that look like bonds and act like bonds, but yeah. This would be a hard strategy overnight to implement. It wouldn't have credibility. How would you fund it? It might take a long time. How do you get from the beginning requirements to something like the ending requirements? That's the subject that I'd like to do today, all right? So even though that sounds like I'm introducing the subject, I'm not halfway through. We're actually coming in for a landing soon. But this is the subject. You can come up with a lot of different ways of reducing capital. One of the things I love about working in insurance is that there's a lot of bright people. If you go around and talk to them, there's a lot of bright ideas in insurance companies. I can list a few on the investment side. Other people can talk about things I have no idea how they work. But there are all these different ideas of how to lower capital, and most of them are focusing one risk at a time. Somebody can do the aggregation with the model and see what the effect is, and then it becomes a project management question. After you get a number of possibilities in front of you, you ask the question, so, all right, which do we choose to do, or which one do we do first, or how do we decide? This is the step from Solvency Pillar 1 to Solvency Pillar 2. You have a model. You have a few bright ideas. If you motivate people, they'll all stand up and say, here's an idea. How do you actually get on with doing it? Here's the answer. I'll give you the answer, and then I'll give you how I got it there. In this particular answer, I said, well, let's not do everything. Let's just do the equity options and doing fewer corporate bonds, and then maybe after we've done that, we need to re-optimize our longevity strategy. So just those three things. That does have a nice return. It's not as high as the 18, but it did give me an increase from 13 to 14. And for those people who need capital to do something else, the capital went from 206 down to 166, a nice gain of 40. So doing a few of them in concert can have a reasonably good effect. And the project management side of all this is that you have to bring a lot of elements that I haven't really talked about so far. I've mentioned them maybe in passing, but you can say, here's all the different ideas of what we can do. Here's the capital savings. Here's what's motivating us. This is the last line from the previous slide. Here's the effect on return on capital. So this is just the net difference from base. So you can see here's the goal, here's the motivating thing. And then you have to have what the Ents from the Lord of the Rings call a moot. You have to just sit down and say, what else are we thinking is important? So what's going to be the ongoing cost for doing these programs? What's going to be the time it takes to implement these? Maybe we can do the equities in a month, and maybe doing the magical new asset investments is something that's going to be a 4 or 5 year project, and everything in between. Can management become comfortable with this? Can they understand it? Is it easy? Is it hard? How long might that take? Will the regulators accept a new asset class? Good question. How long is it going to take it out? It's a consideration. Write it down. And then you can write as many criteria as come to mind, and from that you make a decision. So in this particular one I said, let's do the options first, maybe do a little bit less corporate bonds, and then we'll rejigger the longevity because maybe it needs to be re-optimized, my model it needed to be. And then we have a little extra capital. We've freed up some capital with which we could get some people to go look at the magic assets. Can we invest in energy? Can we invest in food? Can we invest in infrastructure? We don't have anybody who's good at it now, but after we've done a couple of steps, we've freed up some capital and some budget so as we can go do those things. That's what I call the spiral of capital improvements. It works like this. You start here, and you only have a very small budget. This is the thing that actually kills me about this. There's a lot of capital you can free up, but everybody complains they have no budget for this. I don't want to put words in my co-presenter's mouth, but I think Chris presents it very well when he says they have no budget for making more money. It's kind of strange. But here's a roadmap. Find some project that you can do that has demonstrable events very quickly and clearly that it's going to happen so you can show it. And here's the tricky part. Here's the big magic part. You got to train management to remember where that money came from. After saving them 10 or 15 or 20 million pounds, remind them that they have an extra 20 million pounds because of this, so maybe they'll be more likely to give you your £500,000 or £1 million for the next project. So you invest in the first project, you reduce a little capital, you reinvest that into the next project, reduce a little more capital, reinvest that into the next project, and you keep getting a growing cycle. This is the big insight. This is the big takeaway for the evening. That's it.
Open to the floor. Has anybody got a burning question for Matt or Chris?
Bob Holston. Is it working? Yes. Bob Holston. Matt, I'm afraid I'm not sure that companies should be managing capital requirements. What an insurance company needs to do is manage free assets related to its new business strategy. The management wants a stable surplus above its capital. So if you actually invest in assets that actually are more volatile, and your free assets will change. Because after 1 year, correlations become a fact. I'm afraid back in 2008, many of us believed that actually some things that were uncorrelated actually all hit us at once. You have to be very careful. You cannot actually look at a 1 year solvency position. You have to be able to project it, which unfortunately requires you to be able to do nested stochastic projections and then find the probabilities of your free reserves at the end of the year. I don't know whether your work has done that, but your presentation seemed to concentrate on capital, not free assets.
I agree. So I think that you've done the first big step, decided what you're trying to look at. In my presentation, you're absolutely right. It's a limited presentation. I focused on trying to reduce capital. I said that was the goal. In reality, that's not particularly realistic, because if you reduce capital requirements, you can get more free assets, but you're not earning more return on those. It's not clear that reducing capital requirements is what everybody wants to do. For some companies it is. I gave it as an example because it sort of fits in with the introductory sort of nature. It wasn't a big step, but I believe you should manage towards the free assets. If you have a particular use for it, for new business, or you're trying to pay it back or something like that, you should have a very clearly defined version of what you're interested in. In this presentation, I talked about reducing capital, but for many companies, that's not an issue at all. So they might have plenty of capital up here, and the requirements are here. If they move the requirements a little bit, it wouldn't make any difference in their life at all. They still need to earn an amount of money on the whole bit. So I take on board everything that you said. The only place that I might take an exception is I don't think you always need to do nested stochastic, but I know exactly what you're thinking. There are several years going forward that we're not just trying to survive the next year. We have to know, we have to have a constrained model in which we're trying to survive each of the next few years. I think you've got the concept of what I was trying to present even more than I put into the presentation.
Thanks very much indeed. Do we have any other questions at all? Yep, we've got one back there.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Chris. It's Josh. Yeah, two very interesting talks. I thought, Chris, your approach might help Matt reduce the operational risk capital requirements that might feed in as one of the improvements. But I was wondering, Matt, if we all go out and buy equity put options, whether there might be sort of a systematic counterparty risk in the industry. That was one thought. And also, I wondered, would the out-of-the-money put options on equities, would that work for credit risk at all? I know there are a lot of good strategies to diversify away from credit risk, but I was wondering whether the option strategy worked on credit risk too.
So the two questions, one was saying the operation, I guess the comment was that operational risk would help in the efficiency would help in the operational risk. I didn't approach operational risk at all in my presentation. It wasn't even a line. I think it would. I think on the efficiency side, I think it would also help on the investment side. A lot of investment people these days are occupied with business as usual type reporting that isn't clamped down. And if you had the efficiency to be able to do those things very quickly, you'd have more time to do the big brain thinking to do new assets. But back to your actual question for me. Yeah, if we all made a rush to buy out-of-the-money options, if this is what I understand your question to be, would it cause a supply-demand problem that means that the whole thing doesn't work? Yeah, maybe. I think it could happen, but it's not happening right now. Put a different way, it's not my job to work at the industry today. I'm just working on my company. I think if there is a rush on one particular strategy, it will change the pricing on that, and then we'll have to look at a different strategy. These may not work all the time. If one is a really sexy idea and everybody starts doing it, yeah, it might stop being well priced and not as sexy. That's just the way of things. That's why they employ us year after year, not just once and set it on autopilot. About for the corporate credits, yeah, there isn't as liquid an option market there. It's a little bit harder to do the same ideas on the corporate credit spreads, although that's really getting into a technical area. So I'll decline to give a yes-no answer on the last one, if that's okay.
Thanks very much. I just think we had a question in the middle over at the back there. I saw a hand go up.
Hi, I have a question for Matt. What I wanted to ask was that I thought that the options, like all the solutions that you discussed, they all involved cost as well as expertise. Probably something that a big insurer can afford.
Could you speak up? I'm having a little trouble, even with the mic, hearing you.
Is it better now?
Yeah, great.
Yeah. I thought that all the solutions that you discussed, they all involve cost as well as expertise. I thought something that probably a big insurer can afford easily, but something that probably a very small insurance company cannot. So if you have to give a suggestion to a smaller insurance company, what would that be? Like, is reinsurance still the better option for them? Like, to take off, like, I mean, if they want to release some capital.
So if I understood the question, economies of scales mean that
Like,
smaller insurers have
what-
fewer options? What might the options be? Is that generally the question?
Yeah.
Good old question. I do have good daily rates, so we can discuss it. Yeah, it's really hard in a vacuum. I mean, I don't know your company, sorry. I tried to do a very generic discussion with the things that you might do in a with-profits fund versus a specialty annuity person or a general insurer. I don't know that I can start predicating, well, if you're this size company, you should be doing these kinds of things. Sorry to give a cop-out answer on this one. Maybe I didn't hit the question correctly.
You're happy with your answer, though? Jolly good, okay. Any more questions at all from the floor? We've got a gentleman there.
Patrick Schreier. I have a two-part question, Matt. First question is in relation to the second question that was asked. I think the way I understood the question, I don't know if this is correct, but it's something I was thinking about when you talked about the out-of-the-money put option strategy, was more what happens when the out-of-the-money, what type of world do we live in when that sort of put option is going to start being utilized? And in that type of world, how are sort of investment banks holding capital ratios of sub 10% levels? Are they going to be around to sort of act as reinsurers, which effectively we're using them for in that instance? And then the second question, not really related to that, but the second question was more related to the first question, actually, which was on you know...
I wasn't keeping count, so yeah.
Improving ROE by doing it the other way, so increasing capital, which you said, yes, of course, but I was focused on reducing it. But, you know, in terms of increasing in that sense, my particular question was around diversification. Do you think potentially, I mean, we always talk about increasing diversification. You talk about some diversifications, actually not all diversification is good. Is your sense that insurance companies are actually, in many cases, too diversified?
Okay. So the first question was,
need a reminder, let me
can
know.
we use the banking industry as a reinsurer on the financial side?
Yeah. Are there problems with that? With the, you know, what type of world do we live in when you're utilizing it, and are they going to be around essentially?
Did you expect me to say yes, we can do that in the current environment? So I think there are problems with that.
Yeah.
I think the previous model for doing derivatives in which there are so few counterparties has been a large risk for the industry. Everybody knew it. I'm not telling anything that's news or a dirty secret or anything like that. But if you look at the amount of risk you take when you invest in one corporate bond, it's a very small percentage of the portfolio. When you compare that to the outstanding counterparty risk that you might take on 4 or max 8 different counterparties, I think it's quite large, and I think it can be tempered. Now, there is a movement at foot right now to have very vanilla options go through the exchange, and I applaud that. And it's replacing the counterparty mechanism, the funds that you would put with a counterparty, to be a margin type of account through the exchange. And I think that's a great innovation. And you can even have specialized type derivatives that go through. I think that this is a very, very important development that avoids the question that you're just asking. If we have more of them going through the exchange, there's new issues with that, not denying that. But if you have it going through the exchange, you're really reducing that counterparty risk right there. And the banks are on board. I mean, it's good for everybody because they don't like doing it with us either. And
Are insurance companies too diversified, was the second question.
are they too diversified? Yeah, it's an interesting question. We could do it on the stats side and do some sort of answer, but I won't do that. I think that in some senses, yes, they are diversified because they're in the sense of spread thin. So buying a number of different assets can be a good thing. This is the diversification, but that's a statistics argument when you go back and read the Capman. That's how that actually came up. But there's a counter-argument to diversification, which Mark Twain put out. I'm American, so I can quote him. At one point, he quipped that you should put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket very well. I think there's something to be said about that. Some insurers are so big, they can't even get a handle on exactly what's in their portfolio, let alone manage it. That's too much diversification, all right? Where the balance in those is very difficult to say, because one is a statistics argument and one is a management science argument. But I definitely believe there are places in the insurance industry that are, as you would say, too diversified. They're too spread thin for the management. They should just hire more investors. That's my opinion.
And just for my housekeeping, would you count yourself as young enough to qualify for champagne or not?
Within 5 years, yeah.
Within 5 years, okay, I'll put a star next to it. And Bernard, I think you had a question there on the end.
Thank you, Elias. It's Bernard Bergman. The first talk in particular, not unsurprisingly focused on capital, return on capital, reducing capital. I mean, that was the title of the talk. But personally, I have a tremendous problem with steering based on returns on capital, a very capital-focused steering. Because if I'm not mistaken, I don't think the talk actually mentioned the share price and what we're actually doing for shareholders. And instead, it was focused on a policyholder measure of risk and trying to maximize shareholder returns on that policyholder measure of risk. Now, the view of the world that I take is that our objective is to try and maximize shareholder value subject to all the constraints to which a firm is subject. Of course, one of the constraints is capital. Another constraint might be IT, might be sufficiently skilled employees. And the key value driver then becomes not, can we maximize our return on capital, because not all risks actually even have the same price of risk, but can we write risks at a cost of production? Can we actually take on the risks for a premium greater than the shareholder cost of production within the entity concerned? So it's the shareholder cost of production, but within the entity concerned. A risk is a risk is a risk, but it can have second-order effects because of the entity in which the risk is being written. So, for instance, the shareholder cost of production will be the market price of a risk. Now, what's the market price of insurance risk? So you can get some indications of this. You look at the cat bond market, for instance, and you can see that earthquake California and earthquake Mexico, for example, might have exactly the same statistical probability of loss, but will have very, very different prices on those bonds. So we see that there is a market price for the risk, which doesn't, which is independent almost the entity in which you write it, and it's very different. For the same statistical property of the risk, you could have a very different market price of risk. So that's the first part of the sort of pricing equation. You have to write your business at reflecting the shareholder or a market price of the risk, and then to take effect or to recognize the frictional costs of the entity in which the shareholder is writing the risks. You have to look at all the various frictional costs, limited liability put options, agency costs, and all the other things that you can do to try and look at what is the cost of writing the risk within the entity concerned. So I think that the objective function, rather than being maximize the return on capital, should actually be a more shareholder-focused measure of maximizing the value created for shareholders relative to all the constraints and within the firm.
I think I got it. Yes. No.
And we're out of time.
Seriously, I think absolutely you're correct that you need to first decide what it is you're doing. And unsurprisingly, in a 40-minute conversation, I didn't go through all the different dimensions of what you're doing. I think if you're trying to maximize shareholder value, that's a good thing to do. Not all insurance companies are shareholder companies, so that's an interesting question how you actually measure that. A lot of people would say our real focus is, for example, on IFRS profits and low volatility on them. If you have an insurance company with high returns and low volatility, that should eventually have the market value go up. I agree with that, and I applaud it. I think I also tried to say, maybe if it didn't come well because I didn't include it as a point, this is the first step in this process. What is your actual target you're trying to manage? I talked about one target just because you need an example to be able to put some numbers on the board, but I think you're thinking the right way. You should be looking at this is what our shareholders want, and this is the way we should go forward with it. All the other comments that you got was that there are different values of risk. You talked about different catastrophic bonds. There can be a market value of risk. I absolutely think that risk has different values to different players. I have become a little bit of an outlier in terms of my thinking on that. I no longer believe risk is contained in an asset. This is the classic investment model, that risk is an element of the asset, and I simply don't believe that. Risk is an element of the holder. It's in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. A person or a company that's taking it on might view this as an unrisky bond because they have a liability of the same duration. Somebody else who has no liabilities at all would consider it a risky bond, that kind of thing. I believe that that is just true, that risk varies according to the user. And I think that if the risk of different liability, insurance risks as opposed to just market risks, would also have a different use and a different value to different players in the market. The fact that there is one bond that has one price that has cleared the market this day is just that price that cleared on that day. That's not the value that everybody would put on it. So I think there is room there for you to decide who you are as a company, yeah? and add value that way. Did I get all your question? Or is that?
You're happy, Ben? Okay, good. Any other questions that we have? We're about 23 minutes past at the moment. I was told that that you get restless at 20 past and you want to leave. So we've probably got time for about one or two more quick questions if anybody's got one. We've got Andrew there, and you've got another one at the back actually. We're going to take the one at the back and then we'll get Andrew on the end here.
Okay, I was just wondering, bringing the two talks...
Could you speak up to the microphone, please, because we can't
Sorry,
quite hear you.
Is that better?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that okay? Yeah, okay. I was just wondering, bringing the two talks together, to what extent any process errors in your modelling actually mean that you can't be very sure on the impact of certain strategies on your capital position. And I'm thinking in particular of some examples where you've done a bespoke project, but it hasn't had the same controls around it as your normal capital calculation would have. Or you're thinking about investing in a new asset class, which was something that was raised in the first talk, but you don't have a good model for that new asset class, and it's significantly exposed to expert judgment. And basically also if spreadsheets are heavily involved in these processes, as they often are, impacts around the margin will be quite unstable and probably quite unreliable.
Do you want to do this? You want me to? What was the question? My understanding of the question was that a lot of these statistics and processes that we have in place can be unreliable. They have their own volatility with them, and does the variability of it actually affect the ability to do some of these strategies? Is that the basis of the question? Absolutely. So most often, especially when going to a new asset class, the most resistance comes because it's simply a new asset class. But the second most common type of argument against it is, how would we possibly know when we're being able to manage this correctly? If it's a new asset class, you can come to grip with the concepts, but how do you actually get going on it? When you're going into a new asset class, invariably, it's a loss leader for a little while. You're bringing in expert people to understand it, and the amount that you're going to do is small compared to what they cost. That's just a fact of life. And the management has to keep a long-range view that they're doing small positions so they can see how it goes day to day, so as they can become comfortable with their own processes that they can go in a larger way. You can only justify that in a rather strategic way, that this is a valuable direction to go into a couple of these different asset classes. I think the process, this is actually why Chris is here, the entire process question of being able to do some of these things, putting in new changes into an organization, is one of the main resistance to them. That's one of the main drags in not getting them done. Okay. Did you have more on that, Chris?
I suppose I could only comment, really, the context of my bit really was just looking at the facilitating these projects without getting into any specifics. But I do find a problem, I suppose, in the uneven workload throughout the year. There's this huge spike of activity in January and then again in the mid-year. And there's this huge rush for the hard close results, purely because there maybe is a distrust of the models that are used in between, the roll forward. We're not trusting that it's accurate enough. Because we're unable to produce accurate scenario results with any great frequency, we rely on these 2 points in the year, and everything in between which forms our management information, our monthly management decisions. There's a certain amount of distrust, and that's why there's this rush to get the accurate results out at the year end. And I think that's more of a symptom of our distrust of the processes in between, which could be a distrust of the models, the spreadsheets, or whatever it is being used. I think often a lot of these things are a symptom of something else. I think if we focus on improving tools and processes and efficiency gains so that we're able to get results out accurately every month. If we could do that, there isn't so much of a rush to get the year-end result out. We can have the 3 months to get it refined, because we're fine with the January hard close, we're fine with the February hard close. But instead we have this huge push for activity at the year end and the mid-year, and it causes problems. Staff morale, you could go on.
Thanks very much. So we've got 2 minutes left, so if we could just take Andrew as the last question, and then we'll wrap up after that.
Yeah, hi. This is probably a question for Matt. I think the final comment you made was around the hesitation of companies to invest in these, various asset classes or projects, if you will, to reduce their capital. So I guess I can understand that hesitation, because there's no guarantees, and a lot of this is predicated upon models and black box if you're using an optimization type routine. And it also stems from the other points about projecting this through time and what are the unintended consequences of going into these illiquid, unknown asset classes. I suspect you agree with all of this, but I guess
so far
the thrust of my question is, what's your experience? What have you seen in the marketplace? Has there been any significant amount of gaming by insurance companies to say, you know what, we want to make that capital number as small as possible, we'll try anything to do it, that's a good goal?
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I haven't, to be honest, I haven't seen any out-and-out gaming in the industry, not like that. Not at all. But I think the natural reticence is usually from the people I've been talking to, really on the risk side of how do we know how this is going, rather than trying to just fiddle with the numbers. There have been, I don't like to mention names in these kind of things, but a very large insurer has recently gone 100 million into solar cells, solar production. There are incidences of them getting into these types of things, and I view that was such a big insurer. 100 million for them is sampling the water, right? You're putting a little toe in kind of idea. But the thing is that you need to decide what is a size that you're comfortable with, that you can learn on, and then get in it for a few years, and then management will get used to the things that are going on. This is why these things take a long time. That's why the magic assets that we're talking about take 4 or 5 or maybe 10 years to implement. A long part of that is not just getting the first transaction, it's actually getting management to feel comfortable to expand that portfolio. It's an issue. It's a real issue. But if the thrust of your question was, are people gaming it? No, I think they're really interested in doing the right thing.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. So could you all please now join me in thanking Matt and Chris for a very interesting talk. So there's only one thing left to do, and I have to delve out some champagne. Obviously, when we had the microphone earlier, it wasn't entirely obvious, sort of like whether people were students or younger members. So I've chosen 2 of the younger-ish members that I could see from where I'm sitting here, who made a good contribution or a better contribution. So first of all, I think his name is Josh, the first person who asked question number 2, who is sitting there. Could you put your hand up, please? Yes, so that's you. And thank you. And flying the flag for smaller companies, there was a lady over here sort of sitting in the middle as well. So I think she deserves a bottle as well.
Did she get a champagne? Because I couldn't answer.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. So if she could have a bottle as well, that'd be great. Thank you.